Today we're reading from Buck, starting with page 97. Sitting in the shade of the barn, Buck was trying to glue crushed bits of garnet to paper, cut from a brown paper tote, when he heard children's laughter on the road. He was hoping to make a sandpaper superior to what he had previously made with glass. The children ran up to him, with Miss Annie following at a more demure pace. "You've got mail, Buck. So did Miss Annie. She got a letter in a package. You just got a letter." "Well, it looks like I'd better wash this glue off my hands then and read it," Buck declared, as he set his sandpaper and supplies into a small wooden box. He returned from washing up quickly and took the letter that was handed to him. The return address meant nothing to him, and the children's excitement about Annie's mail distracted him from his own for a while. "Miss Annie got a letter from a man, Buck." This was said by a very serious Mary, almost as if it was a warning. "A writing man," added Abel. Elizabeth giggled. "Course he's a writing man if he writes a letter." "Abel means that Mr. Stevenson writes things for a living, Elizabeth," explained Annie. Buck felt something tighten in his chest and wondered if he'd been taking too many things for granted with Annie. He knew that he was as well educated as most, better than many in Colorado, but he was no professional writer. Where had Annie met this man? As if she read his thoughts, Annie turned to Buck. "The town paid my way from Illinois here. Much of the journey was by train, but they didn't pay for first-class seat. I came here in one of those cattle cars they call third-class passenger, and many of my fellow travelers were newly arrived immigrants headed for the California coast. On one long stretch, there were only 2 of us in the car who spoke English, myself and a young Scotsman named Robert Louis Stevenson. His soft-spoken burr and lively imagination made conversation quite entertaining." A smile hovered over her lips as she remembered. Buck felt himself taking an instantaneous dislike to the unknown writer. Annie laughed out loud. "You should see the scowl on your face, Buck Sanders. You'd think I just told you Mr. Stevenson had a reputation like Billy the Kid or maybe the poet bandit Black Bart." "What did you talk about with Mr. Stevenson, Miss Annie?" asked Seth. "Oh, the Scottish hills, the streets of Paris, and what love can make a man do." A dimple slowly showed impishly in Annie's cheek. Mary soberly asked, "Why were you talking about that with him?" "Well, not because he was interested in me," declared Annie. "Then why?" Buck was afraid that his tone was not as casual as he tried to make it sound. Annie threw him a coy look. "Because he was an almost penniless young man who had left Europe and was traveling across country to find the woman of his dreams." She frowned slightly and dropped her tone. "I think she was married, but that was none of my business. He was just a pleasant companion to talk the time away with." "Then why did he write you?" queried Seth. Annie opened her letter, which was already unsealed, and unfolded it as she spoke. "Because he knew I was a teacher, and he thought I'd like some of his work to share with my students. Listen, here is one of his poems. Oh, how I'd like to go up in a swing, up in the air so blue." Annie continued to read the entire poem, then read it again in answer to the insistence of the children. "What's a swing?" asked Elizabeth. Buck cleared his throat. "A swing, in this case, is a seat that hangs between 2 ropes. One person sits on the swing and another person pushes them back and forth through the air." All the children's eyes sparkled. Elizabeth squealed and said, "That sounds like flying." Buck shrugged. "Maybe a little bit. I recall it being fun when I was a kid." "You had a swing?" Seth asked. Buck nodded. "Back in St. Louis. Your ma used to push me." Timidly, Seth continued, "Do you know how to make a swing, Uncle Buck?" Both Annie and Buck threw back their heads in laughter. Annie said, I think I know what the next question will be if your answer is yes. Buck smiled. The answer is yes, and will I make a swing? I'll see what I can do. Mr. Stevenson may be able to write about a swing, but it's your Uncle Buck who can actually make one for you to try, Annie told the children. Suddenly Buck decided that this Mr. Stevenson might be a rather likable guy. He remembered the letter in his own hand and opened the envelope while Annie undid her package. It said, "Dear Buck Sanders, my wife and I would like to thank you for your efforts to care for the children left orphaned by my brother and his wife. We would also like to inform you that we will soon be in a position to free you of that burdensome task. The business that took us away after the funeral is almost complete, so we can return and allow you to return to your beloved mountains and traps. Sincerely, Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Heath." Buck found himself crumpling the letter in his fists before he realized that he might want to try to save it. That night, Buck pounded sturdy pegs into holes he'd drilled into poles to fasten them together. While he was doing this, Annie read to the children from the story contained in her package. Robert Louis Stevenson had sent her several magazine issues containing installments of a story he hoped to soon have published in hardcover book form. It was an interesting tale of a boy who befriended a one-legged pirate, and Buck found himself listening as he wrapped the poles with wide rawhide strips. Then he listened while he dug holes to hold the poles upright. In the story, the boy was sailing away on a ship to find a golden treasure. Buck found a board just the right size for a swing seat and sat down to sand it smooth with some of his new garnet sandpaper. He shook his head in wonder after Annie took Mary, Abel, Seth, and Elizabeth in for the night. Here he was sanding a toy when everything on the farm needed sanding. He'd made the sandpaper to smooth splinters out of the existing buildings and to finish planks used in his new construction. Now he'd have to make more before he started the new building. Still, clothes were a hard-to-come-by commodity, and Buck didn't want the children ripping what they had on a splintery swing seat.